If you're new to making clothes, then this sew along is for you. Today we're going to be making pyjama bottoms using the Margot pattern from Tilly and the Buttons, and I'll guide you through every step. This pattern is part of Tilly Walnes' book Love at First Stitch, and it's perfect for a beginner dressmaker. We'll be looking at fabric choices, how we trace out our pattern, how we prepare our fabric, and how we sew the pyjamas together step by step. Hi, my name's Amy, and I've been sewing in some shape or form for most of my life. I love to share the knowledge that I've built up over the years with others so that you can enjoy sewing and dressmaking as much as I do. So let's get started. So the first decision to make is your fabric choice. So the fabric suggestions that the pattern makes are lightweight to medium weight cottons like cotton lawn, shirting, double gauze or quilting cotton. So you want something that's going to be nice and comfortable to wear in bed, basically, for your pyjama bottoms. So my fabric choice today is this lovely quilting cotton in this jungle design with tigers and monkeys on. And this was given to me as a gift, and I've been saving it to make something really nice. So if you are a beginner dressmaker, I would recommend using something like this, which is the quilting cotton, as I said. This is really nice and easy to sew with. It's not slippery, it won't shift around too much when you're sewing, and just overall a really nice fabric to use. But do think about the climate that you live in. If you are somewhere really hot, not like the UK, then you might want to choose something that's a little bit lighter weight, so a cotton lawn, for example, instead of a quilting cotton. Or if you are somewhere really cold, then you might want to think about something even thicker, so a flannel would be quite nice and cosy for winter months. And if you are a bit more of a confident sewer, then you could try something that's a bit more difficult, like silk, for example, for some really luxurious pyjamas. So once you've chosen your fabric, the next decision to make is the size that you're going to cut out. So you need to be looking at your waist and hip measurements. Obviously, we don't need the bust measurement for the pyjamas because they're just on the bottom half of us. So we measure our waist and our hip and then look on the sizing chart on the pattern to determine where best we fall. So my measurements are 28 waist and 36 hip. So that means that I fall within the size 3 range. So I'm slightly under the hip measurement for the body measurements there, but I know that I will, if I do find that too big, then I'll just pinch out a little bit of it as I'm sewing. But as they're pyjamas, we probably want quite a lot of wriggle room so that they're comfortable, so that might be okay. We can then also refer to the finished garment measurement table, and that shows us the size of the actual garment once it's sewn together. And so we can see for size 3, the size of the hip measurement is 41.5 inches. So if we compare that to the size 3 body measurements, it shows us that there's 4.5 inches of ease in that size. And that means that there's 4.5 inches of additional fabric over and above your body measurements, and that's to allow you to move around and be comfortable in the garment. So you can use both the body measurement chart and the finished garment measurement chart to determine which is the best size for you to cut out. The first step in the preparation process is to pre-wash your fabric. I usually just throw the fabric into the washing machine at the same settings that I'd wash my clothes on, and there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, and probably the most important, is to remove any shrinkage that might be in the fabric before we start sewing it together. Fabrics often shrink by an amount on their first wash, and you want to get this out of the way before you sew up your garment. Otherwise, it could end up being too small after it's washed for the first time. Another reason to pre-wash is that there may be some residue left on the fabric from the factory or mill where it was produced, and it's good to get rid of that before you start wearing the garment. While the fabric is in the washing machine, we can get on and prepare our pattern. So this book has all of the patterns in a pocket at the back, so we need to take out the sheets for the Margot pattern, open them up, and I always give them a light press with a cool iron to help remove the main creases in the paper. You want it as flat and smooth as possible, because wrinkles in the paper could translate to small inaccuracies in cutting out your fabric. So now that I have given my pattern a quick press, I'm going to trace it out. So I've put my dot and cross paper down over the pattern piece, or at least the first one, and I need to identify which line to trace off. So I decided I was going to make size 3, which is this straight bold line there. So on the pattern, we need to identify which one that is. So it's the third one in from the right hand side. So we can just about see that through the paper, and I will take my pencil and trace that line all the way round on all of the pattern pieces. The Margot trouser leg patterns, both front and back, come in two halves, so you need to trace out 4 patterns and then tape the 2 backs together and the 2 fronts together. The pattern shows you where to do this. So my fabric is now washed and dried. I hung it over my banisters to dry so it didn't get misshapen in any way. Sometimes if you hang fabric over a clothes horse, it can leave little pokes in the fabric where the rails stick out, so it's best to put it somewhere it can hang as freely as possible. And now I'm giving it an iron using some steam to get rid of all the creases and wrinkles so it's nice and flat, ready for cutting out. So the first thing I usually look at is the lay plan in the pattern instructions. It's a really simple one for these PJs, as you can see. Lay plans tell you the best way to lay out your pattern pieces to make the best use of your fabric. If you're using a fabric with directional print like mine, you need to make sure that you lay your pattern so that the print is facing the right way up when you're wearing the PJs. So with mine, for example, I want all of my tigers and monkeys to be facing the right way up and not upside down. So I'm placing my pattern with a waistband at the top of the fabric and the print is going down the leg. You need to make sure that the pattern is on the straight grain of the fabric so that the trousers hang nicely on your body and are not twisted. You can do this by making sure that the grain line on the pattern piece, the long straight line with arrows at either end, is parallel to the selvage of the fabric. Put a pin in one end of the grain line and measure how far that grain line is from the straight edge of the fabric at one end and then the other. And the distance should be the same to ensure that the pattern is straight. Here mine is 5.5 inches away from the fold of the fabric at both ends of the grain line. Once you've checked your grain line and put a pin through the pattern and fabric at both ends, you can go ahead and draw around the pattern onto the fabric with a heat erasable pen or some chalk. You can also hold the pattern down with some weights if it's still shifting around. Once I've drawn all around the pattern, I pop in some pins all the way around outside of the pen or chalk line to hold the 2 layers of fabric together as I'm cutting. I then take my scissors and cut directly on top of the chalk or pen line all the way round. Take nice long snips rather than small short ones to ensure that you have a nice smooth cut line. There's only 2 main pattern pieces for these PJs, but you might also want to make a tie for the waist from your same fabric. The alternative is to use ribbon, but I wanted to make a tie, so I'm just taking some of my offcuts and measuring out 2 strips of fabric which are 1.5 inches by half of my waist measurement plus 15 inches. So that's 29 inches for me. The pattern instructions say half waist plus 10 inches, but I've made these PJs before and 10 was a little bit small for me, so I've added 15 instead, and then I cut those strips of fabric out. Before we can sew the PJs together, we need to mark our notches and other reference points. The notches help us to align the 2 pieces of fabric correctly when we're pinning and sewing them. They're marked on the pattern by little small lines on the edge, which could easily be missed, but they are really important. You need to snip into the fabric by about 1/4 of an inch or less through both layers. On these PJs, there's a double notch on the back crotch seam like this. We also need to mark the fold line at the top of the PJs. This is where we fold the fabric over to create a waist channel. And we can do this by using wax paper and a tracing wheel. So place the fabric down on the table and wrap a piece of wax paper around so that the wax side is facing both the top and bottom layer. And lay the paper pattern piece on top and make sure it's properly aligned to the fabric, and then run the tracing wheel along that fold line. And when you remove the paper, you should see a line of wax indicating the fold line. It's not that easy to see on camera, but it is definitely there. Next, we need to mark the reference points for the drawstring opening, and the way that I do this is to lay the paper pattern on top of the fabric, put a pin through the reference point on the pattern, which is a small circle in this case, and then mark with my pen or chalk where the pin enters and exits the fabric on both sides. So we're now on to the sewing. So the first step is to lay one front leg piece against one back leg piece and pin them together. So I'm starting with the inside seam, and first of all I'm finding the notch in approximately the centre of the leg and pinning there, and then I'm finding the two ends of that long seam and pinning at those points, and then I'm filling in the pins in the middle. Then I'm going over to the other side, which is the outside seam, and doing the same thing, so eventually both sides will be pinned from top to bottom, but the curved crotch seam will remain unpinned, and that needs to be done again for the other leg. So just to note that the back leg piece is wider than the front leg, so you will find that the two pieces don't sit flat and there is some excess like you can see here, but don't worry about that, it's normal. We're now at the sewing machine and I'm going to be sewing those 4 seams that I've just pinned, 2 on each leg. So I'm using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and my stitch length is 2.4 millimeters, which is just the default for my sewing machine. So once they've been sewn, we need to trim the seam allowances by about 1/4 to half of their width and then finish the raw edges, and I'm going to do that using my overlocker. So now I'm at the ironing board and I'm going to press my overlocked seam allowances over to one side using a sleeve ham inside the leg, and this will help set the stitches and give a nice neat professional look from the outside. So now we need to start sewing our crotch seam. So I'm starting off here with one leg inside out and the other one right side out. And we need to place the one that's right side out inside the one that's wrong side out so that the crotch seams are aligned and they're right sides together. And now we need to pin that U-shaped crotch seam together. So I'm firstly locating my notches, remember the double one on the back, and pinning there. Then I'm finding the top of the back crotch curve, aligning those corners and pinning at that point. Next I'm aligning the inside leg seams, making sure that the seam allowances go in different directions to avoid too much bulkiness. And you'll see I'm using a clover fork pin here to help ensure that the seam lines match up perfectly. Then onto the single notch on the front crotch curve, and finally the top of the front crotch seam. And then I'm just filling in the pins in between those points. We need to remember to leave a gap where our waist tie will be inserted, and that's where we marked those reference points earlier. And I'm putting in some double pins at the start and end of those points to remind myself to start and stop stitching there. And then it's onto the sewing machine and sewing that full crotch curve with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And here is that U-shaped crotch curve all sewn up. I've then gone ahead and trimmed the seam allowances down by about 1/4 of an inch and then overlocked them separately and pressed them open with an iron. Before we move on, we need to deal with the waist tie opening, and the instructions tell us to sew around that with a little rectangle to reinforce it. So I've done that now, pivoting with my needle down at each corner, and this is what it looks like. So now on to creating our waist channel. So we need to take the PJs back to the iron and press over the top edge to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch. And then we need to fold the fabric over on the fold line that we traced with the wax paper earlier. I think there is some room for confusion on this step, so you're not folding the previous 3/8 fold onto the fold line, you're actually folding the fabric at the marked fold line, so that the waist tie opening is completely covered. And you could check that you've done it right by measuring the amount of fabric which has been folded over to the wrong side, and mine measures just under 1 3/4 inches. Pin that in place all the way around the waistband and sew it down about 1/8 of an inch away from the bottom fold. So now we're really making some progress and we're on to constructing the waist tie. So I've placed both waist tie pieces right sides together and sewn them with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I've trimmed that down and pressed it open. Now I'm pressing under to the wrong side both short ends of the tie by 5/8 of an inch. And from this point the tie is folded a bit like we're making bias binding. So we firstly fold it in half lengthwise and press, then open it out and fold both edges in to meet the middle along that crease line and press again, and then finally fold it in half and press. Then we need to sew along the edge to hold it together. To insert the tie into our waist channel, I'm putting a safety pin into both ends of the tie, attaching one end to the outside of the PJs so it doesn't get lost in the channel, and then feeding the other one through until it comes out the other end. Take out the safety pins and then distribute the tie around the waist. We're on to our last step here, which is really exciting. So off camera I tried the PJs on in the mirror to check the length and marked with a pin where I wanted them to end. The instructions suggest leaving 1.25 inches for the hem, so I trimmed off what I had over and above that and then folded and pressed my hems up by 1/4 inch and then a full inch and sewed them into place. And there we have our finished jungle pyjama bottoms. I think they're really cute. The fabric is thick enough to be worn in bed during the winter and they're loose enough to be really nice and comfortable. And you might have noticed that I didn't bother to pattern match my fabric across the seams. I wanted to keep this sew along short and beginner friendly, so hopefully I haven't got too many inappropriately placed tigers anywhere. If you found this sew along helpful, please do like and subscribe, as it really helps other beginner sewers like you find my channel. Until next time, happy sewing!